Right, I'm going to take it away. Thanks, guys. Appreciate everyone who's attending. Hopefully, you're going to learn a lot about KeyShot here. I'm excited to field as many of these questions as possible. And there are a lot. We're trying to do a lot in a short period of time. So this is going to be a combination of simply me answering questions, as well as me going through with some visual demonstration. And yeah, let's hop into it. So if we haven't met, I'm Will Gibbons. So I live near LA. I'm a render artist, and I work on creating high-end visuals for companies that make the world a better place. So whether it's animations or stills, that's what I do basically all the time. And I've been using KeyShot for as long as it's been around. So I'm going to do my best to field as many questions as we can. In the past, I've done personal projects just for fun. And you know, those are the ones I get really jazzed about, but every once in a while there's a nice client project as well, and I can help them bring their visuals up to the level that they aspire to. So there's just some examples of my work on screen. So enough of that, let's hop into some questions. We're going to begin with materials, and the first question out of the gate is, how do we render a translucent material in front of a colored object? And the way I decided to handle this is we're going to do bullet point answers, and then where it makes sense, I'm going to switch on over to KeyShot and demonstrate it. So my first suggestion here is we're going to use either a solid glass, a cloudy plastic, a plastic transparent, or a plastic medium, or sorry, transparent medium material within KeyShot. So as you can see, there's actually quite a few options that you can go with. And in my case here, hopefully what you're seeing is that even though the word translucent was used to describe what they're going after, we're actually going to suggest that you use transparent materials that you can add cloudiness to so we can see the item behind it. Key things to keep in mind are make sure you have enough ray bounces. That's going to improve the look. Have global illumination enabled, and then consider your transparency distance. And with that, I'm going to hop into KeyShot here and make sure that we see that on screen here. And we're going to run through this. All right, I'm going to let you guys know to hop in and stop me if you don't see KeyShot on screen. Otherwise, I'll assume you guys can see it. And I've got this little example here of a translucent object. I'm going to turn that on, and then I'm going to turn this camera off for a second so we can take a look at this guy. So very simple example, but we have a translucent item. We've got inside it a little stick, this yellow plastic item, and then there's even a little light on top. Let's turn that light off for a moment. And so we've just got this little cylinder, and then we have a translucent bulb. And you can see when I move it for a second, it goes more transparent, and that's just our that's just the like adaptive performance mode kicking in. So when I double click on this guy, you're going to see I chose cloudy plastic. To me, this is going to give you the best results when going for this appearance where you can sort of see the item behind it, but not 100%. And if I reduce the cloudiness, you'll see that you bring the item that's inside it more to, you make it more visible. So really the way this is set up is I've got this little kind of thing that looks like a little kind of a dome shape with some thickness, and we've added, so our transparency distance is going to determine how far light needs to go into this material before it hits our color. So we can see we have a little bit of a bluish tint. If I increase it, it's going to become less saturated. And then our cloudiness is going to increase, like how, make it more opaque basically. And then from there, the one big thing that really helps, in my opinion, is this back scattering. So under our advanced tab, we have the scattering directionality. By default, it's at 0. And what I like to do is I like to push it back a little bit because I think it gives it that kind of milky, desaturated sort of effect that I'm after. And I bring it right up to about negative 0.95. If we go the opposite direction, I'll have a different look to it. And last but not least, if I go to that lighting preset, if I were to go to basic lighting preset, this is how this would look without some of these items enabled, like global illumination, and without enough ray bounces. But I make sure that whenever I get into materials with transparency, I'm in product rendering preset, and that's going to boost some of these settings that are going to actually give life to this material and allow light to move inside of this little assembly here. So again, I have to keep things moving quickly, but that's how I would put an opaque item inside a translucent item and then have it show through a little bit. Even though I suggest cloudy plastic here, you can start to work to achieve this effect using any of the materials we talked about on the slide, and you can refer back to those as well. So the next question is going to be, how do we render motorcycle tires? And so I'm going to suggest that we start with a plastic, and then we're going to reduce the specular value so the light doesn't bounce off it, so it's not as shiny, not as much light is coming off of it. I'll recommend using curvature to control the different diffuse values. We're going to add a roughness texture to add some realism, and then some small noise for a subtle texture. Now, if we pop back on into KeyShot, I'll go ahead and show you what I'm talking about here. So if I go and turn this guy off, I'm going to use part of this camera assembly for my example. And there's this little button here that I think is going to be, it has enough curvature to show off what I'm talking about. So Alt left click to hide everything except for this button. And then these details have been modeled into it. So if I go into this button and I just turn on this plain black rubber, this is a good starting point for this material. So it's just a plastic. And normally specular value is all the way up being 100% white. So what I suggest for a rubber is we reduce that to about 80%, maybe even a little bit lower, maybe 60. So it's not as reflective. And then the roughness, which would start out at 0, is actually cranked up to say 0.2, so pretty high. And then we have the ability to add that curvature that we were talking about. So if I click on the checkerboard to the right of the diffuse and I right click and go to text, oops, that's off screen. Let's go into the material graph. You can see that better. I'm going to have to ask you to ignore all these other multi-materials up here because we're going to use them later in the demo. So just this guy down here, we got our rubber, which is made of plastic, and it's got a little bit of a bump texture on it. If we go and get a texture called curvature, we plug this into our diffuse, we see it gets all these bright colors. And all we need to do is double click on this node and change our positive curvature to a lighter gray, so not pure black. So we're going to go right around here, and then we're going to set the 0 curvature to pretty much the black color that we want on our tire. And for the negative curvature, we will go, we can go also just a touch higher, a little bit brighter than pure black we want. And let's bring this guy down. And last but not least, it looks like these colors are too sharp. So we're going to take our, we're going to turn off radiuses in pixels and set our radius to about 1 millimeter. And you can see it's got a 1 millimeter radius, this fuzziness here. And we can maybe even make that smaller, say 0.5. And then you can reduce, play with all these settings to dial it in. But the idea is that you're going to use a lighter color on the positive curvature and a darker color on the negative curvature. So you've got this kind of rubber-like looking, these different colors going on. And then last but not least, I mentioned a roughness texture. In this case, there's just a uniform roughness, but you could always go into your textures, find something like, say, granite, plug that guy on into our roughness for this. If we preview it with C, let's scale this guy down to 50 or 20, and then let's just make it black and white. And if we get out of this preview, you'll see it's mostly rough, but then you've got some more glossy areas, and that's going to create this kind of worn, dusty, faded, rough look here. And it's just a matter of dialing these in to get that appearance that you're after, but this is generally the framework that I would follow. Again, with the demo, I can't spend time dialing these materials in, but I just want to show you my approach. So hopefully that's helpful. And we'll come back to KeyShot in a second. A lot of bouncing back and forth. Okay, so let's talk about a material graph. So how can I create a material from scratch? So I suggest that you start with a great reference photo because this is going to give us the way things actually look instead of requiring us to pull from memory what we think something looks like. There's a good chance that your memory has skipped over some details. Another thing is consider the real world scale. So sometimes your textures are too big or too small, and this can make materials look weird. Also, your model should be real world as well to scale. I say use the material graph to go from generic to specific or general to specific details. So start with the overall appearance and then work on those little details. Don't start with the most detailed item and then work forward, if that makes sense. And then finally, don't forget about roughness textures. So we just talked about roughness textures, but once again, they really do bring things to life, whether you're working on a metal, a plastic, or a rubber, doesn't matter. Roughness textures go a long way. And you can look more into that if you're interested or if that's a new concept to you. So what about utility nodes? So how do you know what effect they're going to have when using them within the material graph? So the way a utility basically works is it's going to ingest everything connected to the inbound socket. That is the left-hand side of the material graph, or sorry, the left-hand side of the node itself. And then they're going to output a modified result to the next node or the nodes to the right. When you right-click on a utility node, you can use one of the preview modes to see what it's going to do. And then last but not least, if you're stumped, check out the online KeyShot manual. So I'm going to pop into KeyShot so we can take a look at the nodes in here and talk about it real quick. So with this example, if I go back in our material graph, again, we're ignoring everything up top here. Sorry that it's distracting. Okay. So we don't have any utility nodes going on here, but let's say this granite roughness, I want to adjust it with some more detail. I could go ahead and select the connector, left click, then right click, insert a utility, and whatever utilities I can use here are already showing up in the list. And then I can use something like, say, a color to number. And in this case, we have the ability to change the way our map is going to look and the way it enters our plastic. So if I hit C on the keyboard to preview, I'll get a color preview of this node. And if we didn't know that, we could right click and go down to preview color, and that's going to do the same thing. And then all we have to do is consider that we are driving the roughness, and a roughness of 1 is completely rough. So if we reduce this, we're going to take the areas represented by white and make them less rough. And conversely, if we increase the input from, in the blacks are going to basically grow, and we're going to have patches of more glossy areas in this texture as well. So if I get out of this preview with C, you'll see that those changes have taken place. And I will rotate to kind of get our, let's see, maybe if I rotate our environment, we can pop those details out. I'm going to double check my lighting. It seems like things are pretty flat here. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull in a different environment with more contrast. And let's make sure this is set to like 1. There we go. So here we can actually see a little bit better what's going on. But yeah, so we have that variable roughness. And then with those utilities, again, inside our material graph, our list of utilities, you know, the names are pretty descriptive, but for the most part, it's just going to take practice. And I do suggest the KeyShot online manual. And let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick because it's underutilized in my opinion. So when you do go here, you search KeyShot online manual, Google will find it, the first result. Just give a search in the manual what you're looking for. And now you can see the utility node types are here. And I could say, well, how does color to number work? And then you have a fantastic list of examples, context, and supporting text to really break this down. So that's going to be my suggestion there if you really get stuck on something. Let's pop back into our presentation. Cool. So when do we use displacement instead of modeling a detail? And displacement is not typically a substitute for modeling, but there are times when it makes a lot of sense, especially if you're crunched for time. If modeling certain details is going to take a lot of your time, especially if you don't even know if that detail is part of the final design, you may be better off just trying to use a displacement map to see how it's going to look. So a displacement's good for previs before you've really decided on a final design. So when you're going to model, let's say knurling or some sort of ribbing that say wraps around, say like a cylinder or something, that would be really hard to model in CAD for the most part. And in this case, in KeyShot, it's pretty easy. And then also when the form that we're working with isn't too complex. And what I mean is if we were to consider like a cylinder is not terribly complex, but if we have a really organic surface that's going to require some advanced mapping, then that might make displacement a little bit harder to use. So those are my main suggestions. And just to give an example here, inside of KeyShot, let's go ahead and look at, let's go ahead and bring back our camera. And actually with this button, interesting, or not this button, this little guy down here. So this guy, let's turn on denoise. I'll get rid of this graininess, which is really nice. So inside here, we've got, let's make sure that our denoise is turned up a little bit. Okay, this little piece here, I'm gonna rotate it around this grip because, actually maybe I'm not gonna do that at all. Let's just go ahead and take a look at its material. We've got, inside our material graph, we have a number of different sub materials set up. And in this case, we have this rubber up here. It's a plastic with a little texture on it, and it's got a displacement node and a texture. So if we preview this texture, it's a little grid, tactile little bumpy grid, and displacement's gonna actually put those textures right onto our model. So if I were to take this and enable this submaterial by just selecting it from the list, we'll see that the displace function takes place. And if we don't see it, I suspect that I made this happen. There we go. Comes in a little bit slow. And it's a little bit dark, so let's go ahead and make sure that we're in a lighting environment that makes this easier to see. So I've got quite a few going on in here because I didn't know which one we want to use. All right. So if we hide everything else and we look at this piece, you can see on the backside, we've got just this kind of bumpy, tactile sort of surface. And then that's going to be able to, that would take me a long time to model, and KeyShot it, setting up that texture took all of probably 3 minutes, and now it looks, it looks pretty good for how little effort, went into setting it up. So from here, if we wanted to, we could go ahead and bring back this entire camera. And let's say I want to rotate this around so I only have that texture showing. Boom. Now we've got a camera with a different grip on it. And the other side I had to model, but in this case, I didn't have to model, but it was modeled. So in this case, we have these little dots. But now if I wanted to change this into those lines, I could totally do that just by going in and modifying the texture that's controlling this material here. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Let's go ahead and see what else we have in our questions. So next we're going to get into some lighting related questions. And the first one is what is my go-to lighting setup? And we actually saw it for a split second, I think, in there. It's 3 panels straight 4K. That's a free HDRI. It's a procedural HDRI built in KeyShot. It's been in the library for a few years now. And I like it just because it's balanced. It works for nearly every shape and form. It also works well with more specular materials like metals and glossy materials and stuff. And just so you know which one I'm talking about, I'll just take a quick glance into KeyShot and point it out. I think it's in my list here. Yeah, it's active right now. And when you were to go in the list, it's going to be the 3rd one down on the left-hand side in your environment library if you haven't added anything else that has numbers that changes the order. So 3 panels straight 4K, or if there's like say a tablet laying on like a surface facing the ceiling, then I use like a 3 panel tilted because this is a little bit more overhead lighting. But I love these two as a good starting point. All right, let's see. We're gonna go back to our questions. So how do we create a backlit translucent material, kind of like light that's hidden behind a button? And I actually just did some work that had some backlit buttons. So I have some recent experience with this, and I know they can be tricky. What I found to work best was actually what I call a reverse approach. So I started off with a translucent material to get that nice kind of soft plastic silicone look. But then I put an emissive material as a label on top of it instead of underneath it. So rather than putting a physical light behind the button, I actually found that my favorite results came from putting an emissive label on top of a translucent. And we'll layer these up in the material graph and then use color gradients to mask them out. So let's actually take a look at what that looks like. If I go back into here, we've got, this button right here. Remember, we had some multi-materials in here I wanted you to ignore before. Well, we've got this backlit silicone translucent material. And this is going to be one that you can really kind of, it comes down a lot to kind of your look and your opinion as to what you're chasing. But for the most part, this is kind of what I was going for. And it's blown out in the middle right now because we've got it's in an environment that's brighter than the one our environment is now brighter than it was when I built this material. So if I go back to a darker environment that has a little bit less direct lighting, or if I was just to take this and reduce its brightness, say 0.5, you'll see now that this button doesn't look like it's getting too bright in the center. So again, these are going to have, a lot of this is going to come down to making sure that the emissive label is not too bright to make it look weird, because this looks fake. Even though a camera will photograph a backlit button like this, our eyes don't see it like this. So you want to go into your material graph, and let's take a look at this material itself. So in this case, I'm going to move everything out that's not the material we're paying attention to. And while this looks a little complicated on screen, this is what this button is. So if I were to reverse engineer it, we've got a translucent material. So C to preview. This is what our translucent material looks like. And let's go ahead and move this on over. And to get the color of that translucent material, we basically have a couple things. We've got an occlusion texture. So occlusion is one of these cool textures that gives you shading where, like, darker colors where nearby items like faces exist. So this is going to give it some of that kind of more soft silicone-like look. And I'm mixing that with a color gradient, which just happened to start out orange, but I later liked the color blue. I used a color adjust node just to change the hue and make it more blue. So we're basically going from a color gradient that's a darker, more saturated color to a lighter, less saturated color in the middle. And that color gradient is set to spherical. That's how we get that, kind of spherical gradient where it goes from the outside to the inside. From there, we composited those using the occlusion. So that's going to give you this effect. And that went into the color of the translucent material, giving us this nice, soft, almost glowing look, but it wasn't enough. We needed to add an emissive, kind of an actual light emitting material. So this would look bright if we turned all the lights off. Because right now, if you turn the lights down, this material is not emitting any light. It looks soft, but it doesn't actually glow. So we needed to add the emissive label. And we did the same thing. We basically copied this color gradient, and we just made some subtle changes to it. So what you can see is the actual color is going through the same color adjust. So that's the same texture that's going into the translucent is going into the emissive. But then we used a slightly different color gradient for the opacity. And what this does is it says where it's white, it's completely opaque, and we don't even have a totally pure white. You can see I'm adjusting it here. And then the edge is more gray, and that's going to make this emissive label less solid. So if I were to remove this, you'll see the effect. We take it away. And now we put this opacity map in here, and that's going to basically fade some of this out. So we see some of the translucent underneath it. And then this whole thing can be animated. That's the cool thing too. So I know that was a deeper dive than we probably had time for, but this is a very common request, and it's a tough thing to figure out. So I hope that's useful to some of you guys who have projects where you need to do this kind of material. Sweet, so let's go ahead and get back into our questions here. We have lighting is difficult. Can it all be done in KeyShot? And I'm going to argue that it's kind of simple. We just need to know the basics of lighting. And then KeyShot does a very good job of behaving like the real world does. And there are lots of tutorials on the HDRI editor and even physical lights as well. But I'm going to actually suggest, if you find it to be a little difficult, maybe you want to look at how lighting happens in the real world. And for that, I suggest this book called Lighting for Visual Artists. It's a really great book. It's very user-friendly, very good for the beginner. And then I normally start off with an area light as a primary light source, and then I use an HDRI that's been turned down a little bit just to fill out the scene with some extra light. And then sometimes I finish with a flat white or emissive plane to use to create reflections if needed. So what I mean by that, and this won't be a full-on lighting tutorial, but if we move out of here, let's go ahead and see what's in our scene here. So if I go ahead and turn on these two planes I have in my scene, let's go ahead and actually make our background color black or darker so we can see what's going on. So in this example, I have two planes that are lighting my scene. If I were to turn the environment brightness down to 0, you'll see that almost all the light on this camera is coming from these two planes. This one right here is an area light. This one is as well, but they have different brightnesses and they're different sizes. And so when we go and look, if we go back to our saved camera, this angle right here, basically I used these two planes to get the lighting the way I wanted it for the most part. And that also can create the shadows we want. And then you can use an HDRI and you can increase the brightness of that, and you start to bring in that extra fill light, and you can see these like little specular highlights and reflections on the button and on the edge here are coming from the HDRI, and that really pops this out with some nice detail. So I like to use both. But you don't have to know a ton about lighting to use it. Just set up a couple planes, which you can do by going Edit, Add Geometry, and then add a plane, move it around, set it to an area light, and then drag any of these HDRIs in and just try them out and just set them to like, half brightness. And that's a good way to go as well. Pardon me. All right. So this question is actually not going to be a demo, but how do we prepare a project for a portfolio? So in this case, I like to think of KeyShot as like my little digital studio, and I go to paper and I sketch out a layout of the project. So what images do I need? What aspect ratio, like how wide versus how tall are the images? And what is the rough composition of each of my shots? I do that on paper at a very, very small scale. So like 1 8.5 by 11 will literally be the full portfolio page layout for a single project. And then from there, that's your storyboard. And then you just need to create a studio in KeyShot for each of those key images that you're going to use to present your idea, your concept. And then, I can't show you studios given our time crunch, but there are plenty of tutorials on KeyShot's YouTube channel showing you how to use studios. And then consider the format. If this is going to be a portfolio that's likely to be viewed on a certain platform like Behance or Instagram or your website, is it most likely going to be viewed on mobile, or is it going to most likely be viewed on a TV or something? You can consider the aspect ratio, which is important, and the viewing device. And then lastly, render as a 32-bit Photoshop document file for maximum edit flexibility. So I render layered PSD files. So if we go into KeyShot there, I'll at least show you. When you go to do your rendering, your format can be set to Photoshop 32-bit. And then you get access to all the render passes, all the render layers, you add them to a PSD. And what this does is, for no extra cost, render time-wise, you get all these extra layers that makes your image easier to edit and extends the number of use cases and scenarios you can actually use your image. So that's what I would recommend if, when getting ready for a final presentation. Alrighty. We're going to check out, okay, max samples versus max time versus custom control. There's a lot of complexity behind really knowing the difference of these. but we can summarize them and we can make some generalizations that make them pretty simple to know when to use what. So max samples, I'm going to say that I use it 90% of the time. And I do so because I want consistency from one rendering to the next. I know that max samples indicates a level of doneness, of completion. And so based on the type of materials in my scene, I have a good idea. If it's cloudy plastics, I'm going to want over 1,000 samples. If it's basic materials, I might want over just 300 samples. If I have, certain shadows that I want to emphasize, maybe I bump those up a little bit. But the point being that I use max samples most of the time because it's consistent. Then I use custom control if I have to prioritize anti-aliasing or depth of field. Again, more of an advanced approach, but if you're using certain features like depth of field, or if you have areas where you get that jagged stair step kind of outline of a product when you render it, then anti-aliasing, increasing that in the custom control settings could help you with that. And finally, I use max time if, say, there's a deadline and you need all your images done by a certain time, and you're willing to compromise on, I don't want to say compromise in quality because it looks the same as max samples. However, how resolved it's going to look is just going to come down to how much time you give it and how fast your computer is. So for me, again, max time is really a tool to, it's more of a scheduling tool when you have a deadline. If I don't have a deadline, then I don't bother with max time really. All right. So I know we've done a number of demos, but let's see what else we have. So how do we render a realistic digital display with a nice reflection? So I suggest that you have a basic glass material in front of the display itself. So model that in. Don't rely on just one material because we can't layer transparent materials in the material graph. So I can't just put glass on top of something. Then we want to set the display material to an emissive type and then use an emissive plane to create a reflection or say a flat plane in the display itself. And then you could animate the plane if you wanted to. So what I mean by all this is, let's pop in a KeyShot. The back of this device has a display on it. And you can see, if I go to move this piece, it is just a piece of glass and it's modeled with true thickness. And when I double click on it, I chose solid glass. That's because this is a solid material. If this was just a thin single piece of glass without any thickness, then maybe I would just use the basic glass material. And then behind it, let's go ahead and look here. We have a display. So there's a rear glass, and then we have, let's go ahead and just hide that so I can quickly select this. So in this back, we have a hard, shiny plastic, but if I click on inner emissive, what you can see is that I've got an, let's go into our material graph. It's just a image and then our emissive material. And the image itself is what's giving us that display. Otherwise, it's just gonna be a flat color. So I plugged that into the emissive material. And this was just the black material there. So around the edge, I'll call this out too. If we select this piece, you can see there's another, this little, like, I don't know, a frame, if you will, or bezel. This is one thing that helps make things look a bit more realistic from a display standpoint when you have this, what's called dead space around a monitor. Almost everything has it. It just helps frame this up a little bit better. And then when I bring that glass into view, that glass, your refractive index is going to control how reflective it is. So if we have something to reflect off the surface, let's go ahead and rotate this camera so we can reflect our plane. So bring this guy around. So depending on our camera angle, that reflection is going to be visible. So let's move in here. If I go to rotate this guy, you can see it's reflecting that plane behind us. So creating that nice reflection, you can either do that using a physical plane, or you could simply go into your HDRI editor, and then you could set a highlight, and you want to then cut that in half, and then you can rotate it with the angle right around there, and let's make it bright. Let's go like a 5. And then you see you got those stair steps, those jagged stair steps that look real ugly. Well, guess what? We can go ahead and fix that by making sure our, actually, so see how this is an image? If normally you'd go to background and then you could up-res the scale. But because this is an image, we are limited to the resolution of that. But with any of the other HDRIs where you don't have an image behind it, you can up-res all the way to 10K. And then when you hit this refresh button up here, it's going to sharpen that line. If you need it razor sharp, then use a procedural environment, one like this. So you could actually change the resolution there. So kind of a long answer there, but that's how we do that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and hide that pin and pop back into our questions. So how do we render a white product on a white background? And this is a pretty common request. And what I recommend doing is starting out kind of letting go of the idea of white. So in KeyShot, well, I mean, sorry, on screen, when we choose pure white, not only is it void of color, we have LEDs in our display backlighting it, making it even brighter. So when we're trying to replicate white products in the real world, they're never going to be that bright. So my suggestion is start with everything material-wise at a 70% gray instead of pure white. And that gives you something called headroom. What you do is you start with a gray, and then you go ahead and use specular values. You can adjust how reflective your surfaces are, increase the lighting in your scene so that that 70% gray starts looking a little bit closer to white. And then what you can do is you can use, say, specific planes or pins to reflect light. You can use roughness to make something look a little bit shinier and kind of separate materials by roughness. And last but not least, you can then render clown passes. So if you need to in post-production, one of the biggest challenges is, say, a white plastic that's glossy next to, say, a metal. It's almost impossible to reflect or light one of those materials without affecting the other. So that's where clown passes can help you make local adjustments in Photoshop afterward. But once you start with the 70% gray and you start lighting it and doing all that, you can then, because it's only 70% gray, start to increase the material's brightness itself to come closer to white. So if we look back into our KeyShot scene, I do have a white product. I don't know. Okay, so if I have a background here and it's white, I think we're in photographic style. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's make a new image style, go to basic, and then let's make sure that we're not super duper bright with our environment. Make sure our background's white. And then our camera, like this material, let's go ahead and look at how bright that is. Oh my goodness. Sorry, this is a little scary. This is because I made this kind of crazy terrazzo material on here. Let's actually do this. Let's unlink this material and just go with a white plastic. If I throw this on to begin with, it looks good and it's white. But if we put it on, say, the this material here, it may be a little reflective, and then you start to lose the edge. I think this is generally where people get frustrated with white on white. And so with that, my suggestion is that this is too bright. This is 100% white. I say go to 70, which sounds dark to begin with. And then I say start reducing the specularity just a touch if you need to get back some of those, the edge that we're losing. And then from here, we still have our material that's still a white material. And then what you can do is start using your lighting to create reflections where you need it and start brightening it up and everything. And this still reads as a white, even though it is indeed a whatever, 70% gray or something. And then from there, you're still working within here. So if you need to brighten something, you can, or darken it. There's a lot of approaches, and that's why I mean, this whole webinar could be all about white on white. But that's why I gave you a bunch of ideas here. Start with something about 70% gray and then start pushing all your other values like your lighting and reflections before you just increase the overall brightness of that base diffuse color. And then we have a few odds and ends questions here. So what are the biggest differences between, say, professional and amateur rendering? And this is a really tough one to answer. This is really subjective. However, I believe that design fundamentals like lighting, composition, and proportion is going to give, is going to be what separates what looks like amateur renderings versus professional. So when you have an amateur who's focused on where the buttons are and what value their light should be and what image style they should use or whatever, they're getting hung up on the technical stuff. They're not focusing on the basics, the fundamentals, like make sure your composition looks good, make sure that your lighting makes the image easy to read both at a small scale and a large scale. Things like that. I think professionals have a good intuition for fundamentals that make their image strong. And then another thing is sharp edges and perfect surfaces. So if we were in KeyShot and we had a model like this guy, and I might have modeled details into this. I have a habit of modeling everything, all the details. So this may not be a good example. However, we do have, when an object is selected in KeyShot, we have these kind of, these sharp edges in here. And if I were to go and set, so let's change this to a bright color or a vibrant color. It's kind of dark and glossy. Let's go ahead and do that. Looks like I have a texture on there too. Let's delete it. Cool. So I think we have some sharp edges in here. And the idea is that with this selected, you can always go into your rounded edges and type in, say, like 0.1. Let's do 0.5. And what it's doing, let's try 1. So where it can, it's actually putting a small radius in here and it's reflecting the light. So all the inner edges where all these sharp, crisp edges used to be, by using this radius slider, I'm adding some details there that maybe weren't there before. And if you have a model full of sharp edges, like this one might, again, I might have just modeled all those details in, but if this didn't have all those fillets or radius, you could use this type of tool to give you all those little highlights, and that's gonna make your image look far more believable and less amateur. And same thing with the perfect surfaces. Having those slight roughness textures or roughness maps really helps make something look a lot more realistic. And finally, oversaturated color and heavy-handed post-processing. So you have the ability in KeyShot within your image styles to very easily just go in and, let's say I want this to be photographic image style. If you get a gray background in your photographic image style, just go down to layers and choose background color and set it to white. But what that does is that gives us the ability to go into our colors and we can play with things like saturation and vibrance. And these two things are going to help. Like if you got an image that looks like this, it's so bright blue, like it looks fake. So you're better off going and letting this, be slightly desaturated or choosing a color that's not too bright. And then the heavy-handed post-processing, that's where you got like this going on, and you got this guy cranked up to like 5 or something. It looks like a super crazy Transformers, like you're gonna get sick in the movie theater look. Too much excitement. So you don't wanna do a whole bunch of effects because again, no one sees anything like that and it doesn't bring anything to the actual image. So, no filters, things like that. That's kind of old school. Okay. And staging and props is the last one. So not having an image floating in space, but at least having a plane underneath it, having some nice shadows, or having some like pillars or some abstract surfaces behind your object just to place it in a setting is going to give you a lot more professionalism. Why did I start using KeyShot and how did I learn so much about it? So I started when I was in design school. I was doing product design, and KeyShot was one of the tools that we used to make our SolidWorks models look nice and presentable. And then I really enjoyed that process. So I just fell down that rabbit hole and chose to only spend my time rendering and not designing products. I began learning everything I know by going to the KeyShot forum, which is where I highly recommend everyone get started. There is so much knowledge, like 10 plus years of knowledge on there, which is great. And then when I joined the Luxion team, I used to do, on-site training for Luxion, and I did, KeyShot training. I got to give a shout out to my buddy Richard. He taught me a lot of what I know, all these little details, and then also being able to work with the dev team and work with Luxion to create training content. If you want to learn about any tool, teach it, because it forces you to turn over every little stone and ask why something works, because if you can't explain it, then you probably don't know how it works. So lots of teaching. And then I think this may be our last slide, actually, but it's what advantage does KeyShot have over other render engines? Big question. There's a lot of render engines out there, but to be quite honest, I think Studios is probably my favorite powerful feature within KeyShot. And I think it's pretty unique. I don't really have a lot of experience with other render engines, but I will say that KeyShot's ability, if you haven't seen it, to create studios. I know I talked about it earlier, but if I hit U on the keyboard, it brings up the studios section. And a studio, you see all these boxes, one for camera, one for environment, one for image style, model sets, multi-materials. Basically, you can build a list of what are studios, and those studios allow you to connect or set levels of dependency on these items. So as I mentioned, if you're creating a set of images for a client or for your boss or for your portfolio, you can create a studio for that nice juicy banner image that's kind of abstract, zoomed in, dark and moody. You can also then create your, let's go ahead and turn this guy back on. So you could have the, super zoomed in, kind of, like I said, dramatic look, and then you could create a different studio that's going to be like, say, your exploded view, and then you could have one that's like a feature view, and then one that's a catalog view. So you can create studios that have all the attributes of all the types of renderings that you want to create. And again, I don't know that really exists in other rendering software. All right, and then HDRI Editor makes lighting very fast. I know not every other rendering software has that, and it is great because there are plenty of times on projects when I just use the HDRI Editor. That's it, and it does the job just fine, and it's super fast. We're talking 2 minutes tweaking, and then you're good to go. I think KeyShot's also very easy to learn. It's very approachable, but a lot of people learn that KeyShot has depth that is not apparent at first look. So when we get into things like the material graph, doing some animation work, maybe some little things for productivity like material templates and studios, I think that people are surprised to find that KeyShot can do more than they expect. And then finally, I think that the simple material models is a big deal as well. And what I mean by that is not all the other render engines have material types like this, where you can choose, say, oh, I want to go with a solid glass, or I want to go with a, cloudy plastic or something. And that's going to, give you results really quickly, basically. Whereas a lot of other render engines start out with what is now KeyShot's generic shader, and you have to know what to mix and match just to recreate a real world material. And that can be a little bit confusing. I love that KeyShot has the generic shader now, but I think that having these basic, simple material models that just give you what you need to start with really helps keep people on track and not wasting time in the software. So with that, I think we've done the impossible. I think we've actually gone through the slides in less time than I expected. I was a little concerned we were going to run out of time. So, plus I've got another cup of coffee in me, so maybe that's why we're going quickly. But I think if we're going to look at the silver lining here, we'll probably have time to take questions from those who are watching right now. And I can go back over anything we already talked about if it felt rushed. I'm going to go ahead and see if anyone else on the webinar can chime in with any questions, and I'll do my best to answer those guys.
Great. Will, that was fantastic. Thank you for covering so much ground there so quickly. Great to have that. So just one question so far. If anybody else has any questions, inside of Zoom, you see the little Q&A icon down there. You click on that and add any questions that you have. Just type them in there. We have a question from Dan. He's saying, and this has actually related to the translucent materials I think you were showing earlier, when he has translucent materials showing, it looks correct in KeyShot, but when he renders it or exports it out as a PSD file or any format, he's saying, the rendered object comes out dark and you can't see the details.
Interesting. That's an interesting challenge. I'm trying to think why that would be. In my experience, what I see in the real-time view is basically what I get. Now, there's only two things I can really think of that might cause that. Hopefully I'm not skipping anything. But the first one that comes to mind is that you may be using the custom control for your render settings. And the reason this might matter is because as far as I'm aware, this is you giving your own kind of formula to KeyShot's render algorithm. Now, the real-time view seems, in my experience, to most closely represent the maximum samples or maximum time. And so with that, I'm almost always using max samples, and it's looking pretty much the same. Now, if you like for instance, if your real-time render settings are very, very different than your settings in, say, custom control, then you could be getting a discrepancy there. Another thing that could be happening, and I'm not entirely positive, but when you click on a material and change its color, you get into the color picker where we define colors, and there's a little wheel here, and there's the options for use gamma corrected values for input and apply image gamma to colors and swatch it in the color picker. This, I'm not going to try to explain what gamma is and does fully here, but gamma is going to be a process that is applied to a digital image so it displays correctly on screen. And then what happens is when you render out your image, if these two boxes are unchecked, you may be not applying a gamma correction of what you see on screen, but then rendering it out in sRGB, which does undergo a gamma correction. So without getting into all that, I think that, double check that I would think that these, the color picker, I would make sure these two checkboxes are turned on, which is KeyShot's default. And then just double check your render settings, try max samples, and lastly, make sure that if you're going into custom control and it's causing such a discrepancy, make sure that your, say your ray bounces here are not like 2 or 3 with like 1 global illumination, versus something that's very, very different in here. So other than that, not sure. That's a tough one.
And yeah, if you have obviously questions, just a reminder for folks that you can also go to our support forum, and our support team can also, if you have like specific issues, you can always send the issues to them and they can take a look at it and probably dig in more detail. Another question from someone is they want to use the bloom effect, but they don't want it to kind of bloom out their product highlights. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Let's go ahead and make something bright. Like I'm going to make this a metal material. And then let's make sure our planes are on. So we have some nice specular highlights here. Bingo. And then let's make this guy just black, just to give us some contrast. Cool. Okay. So if I go into our image tab and we turn on bloom, and I crank this up to 1, and let's crank our bloom radius up to 40. So we got this look. Now we can take bloom threshold and increase it. So this is going to reduce where the bloom is applied. Notice that I can increase this all the way until it's only happening on this metal object. The reason that happens is if you try to recreate this in Photoshop, it won't work the same because Photoshop is going based off of the RGB value of that pixel. So if it's white, everything that's white in your whole scene is going to get the bloom effect. But in KeyShot, it's looking at luminosity, if I'm right. So that's going to be the brightness of the surface. And if this is metal reflecting a bright light behind it, then the value or the luminosity on this surface is much greater than the white over here. So what that does is this bloom threshold is saying it's got to be, at the higher we go here, the brighter the surface has to be to still get that bloom effect. So if you're getting this thing where your bloom threshold isn't really separating those values, then that means that you don't have enough dynamic range in your image, and you need to have some brighter light sources and brighter reflections in order for KeyShot to see a difference between those white areas. And then lastly, if you want to make it a little more realistic, I always reduce the bloom intensity a little bit. So hopefully that clears that up.
And that's why he's a pro, ladies and gentlemen. Fantastic, Will. Thank you. Any tips on making wood not look so fake? So they're trying to get wood to look as real as possible.
Sure. Good question. So I'm going to add a ground plane and then just go ahead and search. Let's see, we have our wood materials here. So if you start off with something like this, this is a great starting point for something that's like a stylized kind of a laminate for like, a children's desk, something kind of cheap looking, but it will get you going. Now, when you say make wood look realistic, there's so many types of wood. We gotta get a little bit more specific. We can use a procedural if the form of our model is interesting. So if I put this on like this guy, now we've got wood grain, and that's going to look way more interesting and more convincing than this does, which is really just an image texture. So I want to start by saying, make sure that if you can, instead of using a material that's based off of just a single image texture, you want to use one that's got that's being built off of what's called a procedural texture. So inside KeyShot, you've got this procedural wood texture node, and that's going to give you this kind of grain that moves through the entire product. There are some tutorials available online where a lot of detail you can learn how to get a lot of detail out of KeyShot's procedural wood. The other thing is, if you're looking to truly match, say, like a photo reference, then you have to go with a high quality image texture that is going to be, quite high res. But the downside to that is, unless it's a repeating tiling texture, you're going to see patterns of it, kind of like you see on the ground plane here. So if you go with a high quality wood texture, it has to be very high resolution, and it has to be a large area. Websites like polygon.com and textures.com and stuff are where I would go to find those. You can also check the KeyShot cloud library for that. Go ahead and check there before scrounging all over the internet, because if you've got something in the cloud library that you want to use, you can use that as well with less effort, basically. So the long answer to the short question is, it really depends on what type of wood and how it's got to look, but there's a few approaches you can take.
Great, awesome. We have two liquid and glass-related questions. The first is, how do you make glass look realistic without any liquid inside? And second, if you wanted to have something like lemonade, which was sort of, an off color, they're saying is coming out kind of more looking gray than the traditional yellow. So I don't know if you can touch upon kind of liquids and glass real quick.
Sure. So we have, pardon me. So we have, in this case, the first one's easy to describe this or answer. The second question, maybe not with what I have on hand. But if I go ahead and check out the two types of material we have for glass, at first this doesn't do it justice. This doesn't look so great. Kind of looks like an X-ray material. First, I will say that your model should have thickness instead of being a single surface. And then if it does, you want to make sure refraction is turned on. In glass, KeyShot's basic glass material does not have refractive turned on. Turning this on will make it, pardon me, will make it look more realistic. And at this point, we're looking at something that is essentially the same as solid glass. Now, the reason we're getting this weirdness, I think, is because we've got our photographic image style with this not so realistic background. So let's go to basic. Let's make sure environment background color is not this yellowish color. Very good. Okay, so we're looking at a solid glass. Again, I recommend using solid glass all the time. And then if you don't have enough contrast in your environment, then you're not going to have enough contrast in the reflections and refractions of your material. So let's go ahead and turn those planes off because those are still lighting this. Oh, no, they're not. Okay, so if I hit E to show my environment, we can see there's our environment. And if we go in here and look at our background, let's actually just save us some time and just drag a new one in. I wanted one that has this dark black background. There we go. So you can see here by having the dark areas as well as the light areas, even if we hit C on the keyboard to go to a solid white color background, we now have the dark areas that show up in the refractions and the white areas in the reflections. And if you have, like, say, just the default startup environment, to me, this doesn't sell it. This doesn't look right because it lacks that contrast. So make sure you've got an environment that has enough contrast for that glass to really pop, and then you'll see that. And then lastly, as far as material inside a glass, like a beverage or something, I'm not going to be able to demo that here, but the big difference is that you're going to want to make sure that if you have a liquid inside a solid, that those two surfaces are not touching. The liquid should penetrate into the solid just a little bit, and then you can drag your two materials on. And then the second thing you want to make sure is that they don't have the same refractive index. So if I have this here and this was my glass, it would have this value. But then if I had, say, a liquid, like if I put like liquid, just put water on here, you can see this material is slightly different. It has a refractive index and a refractive outside. So you set this refractive outside to be 1 or leave it there. And then this refractive index, if this is set to 1.5 and it matches the glass, then you're going to get that weird effect. If you make it just ever so slightly different, it will or should look normal. And then lastly, make sure that you have, again, your global illumination on, enough ray bounces, all that stuff. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. One question I want to just jump in. Some of this can kind of how to run KeyShot on a lower spec laptop. So I don't know if you want to maybe touch on kind of performance mode and maybe when you use performance mode.
Yeah. So the first thing I always recommend is no matter how powerful your computer is, I don't typically recommend running KeyShot on all CPU cores. So up in the left-hand corner, you can change the drop-down menu from the number of threads or cores that your machine has. I always reduce it a little bit. In fact, I leave this at 50% most of the time. If your machine has 8 cores, then maybe bring it down to 6 instead of 8 for stability. The next thing I recommend is go ahead and turn on that denoiser, which will use, if I'm not mistaken, use your GPU to squash out some of the graininess, the noise that you get. So if I turn on everything in the scene here for a model, we got this graininess, and then after sitting for a few seconds, it will actually turn off, and now it looks smooth. That's a nice way to not wait for things to render if it's running slow. You can also, like Derek said, go to full-on performance mode, which will look less realistic, but notice how snappy and real-time this looks. It's nice and fast. So this allows you to work nice and quickly. And then once you've got your scene set up, let's say I want to render this out, I would turn off performance mode. And then from here, I would go in and make sure that my render settings here are in product mode. And let's say I don't need, you can also reduce some of these settings a little bit, but just beware if you reduce ray bounces, that if you have a transparent material, it's going to go black at some point. So you need to go high enough that you can see through the transparent material. You don't have any black areas. And then that's the number of ray bounces you need. And then with all that, you should have a pretty smooth experience on KeyShot, even on a smaller, like lower spec laptop.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just to clarify, there is both a CPU and a GPU denoiser. So if you're running CPU, it'll run the CPU denoiser, GPU, the GPU denoiser, but they essentially have the same effect regardless. It's just a matter of kind of which code path you're using. Yeah, one person's asking, they're using render region or region render, but it's not rendering the image that's on the real-time view. So if you can kind of maybe briefly talk about how you use region render.
Sure. I mean, let's say I needed to, for some reason, just pull this part off. If you go to do your rendering, I don't know if for some reason this is turned off, this little checkbox here. If this is enabled in your rendering output, it should indeed render this whole black area with just the image inside here. Region render doesn't trim out what's in the window. And the reason for this is so you can composite this on top of something else. So let's say I just needed to fix this button. Let's say this button turned out grainy or the different color. I could render this region like this, and then I could lay it over the original image without having to reposition this portion of the image, because it's going to render out the whole canvas or the whole image, which will stack right on top of my previously rendered image. The other way you can use it, if you're not actually doing renderings of a region, you can go ahead and hit H on the keyboard, which will show your heads-up display. And it gives you a bunch of information. It's like your dashboard. And the samples that are going up in real time show you how many samples have rendered on screen. So if I don't know, let's say when I get to my final image here, if I go to my output and I say, I don't know how many samples I need. Is it 15? Is it 60? Whatever. I'd be guessing. But if I go ahead, I'm going to turn off the noise just to make this clear. If I go ahead and pull up my region render, Control-Shift-R, and just drag this over the noisiest part of my rendering, all those little black specks, and then I hit H on the keyboard, I watch these samples increase. And when we don't see any graininess here, or at least they go down to a level of acceptability where I think they're good enough, I'm like, oh, it's at 64 or whatever that is. So I go ahead and close this, go in here, type in 64. And now I know that when I render this entire thing out, it'll go to the level of, it'll cook as long as it needs to remove all the grain, basically. And the purpose of the region render is it helps us get a very quick read on how many samples it will take, because it's only rendering this small portion, whereas if I get rid of that, it's rendering the whole image, and you'll see samples go up much more slowly without the region render. So there's kind of two ways you can use it to figure out how much samples you need to render for your final image, or you can just render out a region of your image to, say, patch in a correction from a previous rendering.
Great. Thank you, Will. So a couple of folks are kind of just asking both about this webinar and just sort of general information. So all of the webinars are streamed to our YouTube channel. And so you definitely follow up there if you came late or needed to leave early. And we actually do cut these up so you can kind of have the smaller chunks on there. But I highly recommend everyone subscribe to our YouTube channel, because we have tons of great content, from kind of deeper dives in terms of, Will did a great hour-and-a-half session on lighting as part of our virtual KeyShot world, so you can really deep dive, as well as quick tips that kind of just give you really quick, 2 to 5 minute overviews of different features and tools of KeyShot. So I really recommend folks subscribe to our YouTube channel to get both this content as well as all the other great video content we produce. So we're kind of coming up here about 50 minutes over, Will. So I'm gonna grab one more question and throw it over to you. For other folks, like I mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to either go on our forums and ask, or to support if it's more of a technical question. So one person's asking, when they're rendering a PNG for an environment with a white background, they're getting a thin white edge on the product that's visible when they place that PNG over a dark background. So I'm assuming they're kind of talking when they're going into Photoshop. How do you prevent that white edge so you don't have to kind of edit it out later?
Yeah. Good question. So first of all, if you find that you've got that issue, just FYI, in Photoshop, you can go and do something called remove white matte, and it'll pretty much in 2 clicks get rid of it. If you've got old images you need to remove that from. But moving forward, let's say we want to avoid that from happening. You've got this thing, when you click on Include Alpha, it pops up. you have a setting where you should be able to change it. Let me see here real quick. I guess I was thinking about under render layers where you have the option to change straight, alpha, unmatted, pre-multiplied, or opaque. I think they might have, I think that when you include alpha transparency, it should just be straight alpha, which is what you want. So unless I'm forgetting that or mixing that up with something else, the other thing I was going to tell you is that one other very common issue if you do render with transparency, let's say I have something like ground shadows on, and I do here. Let me go ahead and just move this camera down to the ground a little bit. Just snap to the ground. So if I were to render this out and you are getting white or gray image, you know, color contamination in your shadows, one thing you can do is go ahead and set your set your background color to black. And this actually should help you with your edges here as well. But what it's gonna do is it's gonna kind of give you, you know, any of the shadow is going to get multiplied on top of this or blended into this dark black background. And the black, you won't see this in your final rendering, but it's going to help preventing white from leaking into the shadows. And it might actually help clean up that edge that you're seeing. But notice we're not getting black reflections in our product. So just changing this background color of your environment will not have a negative effect or any effect at all on the product itself. The only time it will is if you're rendering something transparent like this glass. Now you can see through the glass, you see that black color. So if this was white, now that glass is more white. So that's the one time you got to be careful. But if it's an opaque item that you're rendering out, then you could, you know, set your background to black, and that should help.
Awesome, wonderful. And a reminder, Will also has his own YouTube channel, so Will Gibbons, so you can get more of his great content there as well, in addition to the KeyShot YouTube channel. But Will, thank you so much for joining us today. Very, very informative as always. Any parting thoughts for us before we go?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and share some of this stuff. I know there are a lot of questions. You know, a lot of this, I think a lot of this comes down to, I hate to say it, but practice, but also just the KeyShot manual. I'm going to shout that out again, because I know it wasn't always as robust as it is, but it has almost all the answers right there. And you can go to help and then manual. In KeyShot, this will just link you straight to the website. And it's got your online manual, which is very searchable. So if you can't find your answer right away, go to your manual. And then if you can't find it there, then head on over to the forum or somewhere else. That's going to be my 2 cents on troubleshooting. But other than that, till next time, guys, happy rendering.
Thank you so much, Will. Appreciate it. And have a great day, everyone. And we'll see you again soon.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Bye.